Hello, leaders of the world. Welcome to Spread Love in Organizations, a podcast for purpose-driven healthcare leaders striving to make life better around the world by leading their teams with genuine care, servant leadership, and love. I'm Naji, your host, for this special episode in collaboration with MIT Sloan Healthcare and Bioinnovations Conference, an event that brings the healthcare ecosystem together. I have the pleasure to be joined today by Michael McKeown, acting CSO, head of research for a stealth startup at the Harvard Life Labs. Michael started out in California getting his BS in chemistry at UCSD and working in the Nobel Prize winning Tsien lab on fluorescent proteins. He then moved to Boston, earning a PhD in chemical biology from Harvard while working on novel cancer therapeutics at Dana-Farber. During this time, Michael contributed to several startups spun out the lab, ultimately joining Syros Pharmaceuticals. As part of his work, he developed novel patient biomarker and pharmacodynamic markers to enable selection of the right patients and kinetic monitoring of response. With 10 years of industry drug discovery and development experience in the Boston area, Michael has contributed and led multiple successful programs. Most recently, he led pharmacology at Kronos Bio, supporting combinations, biomarkers, and PD assays for the clinical program, as well as leading biology for their most advanced preclinical program, generating an asset currently in IND-enabling studies. Michael, it's so good to have you with me today.
Thanks for having me on.
Before we dig in innovation and decentralization in clinical trials, the topic of your panel in the conference, I'm eager to hear more about your personal story. What brought you to the biotech industry and now heading research in a biotech?
Sure, thanks. I've always had a very strong interest in science, and I was very fortunate when I was down at UCSD to be able to work with the Tsien lab. And getting to experience fluorescent proteins and imaging. And from there, I moved to Boston, and I got to hear a lecture in one of my classes from a professor, James Bradner, who was just starting out at the time. But he was so inspirational and so passionate about cancer therapeutics and helping patients, and especially as a physician scientist, that I signed up and joined his lab. When he was at Dana-Farber. Of course, he went on from there to head up NIBR, and he's now at Amgen. But it was just such a cool experience to be able to do research in a context where we were passing by patients, seeing them, seeing the real effects of this every day when we were getting lunch and in the building.
So going from there and from labs, as you said, to a startup world, several startups spinning out of labs, and now up to pre-IND assets. So I'm intrigued by your leadership learning. What did you learn along the way, moving from academia to entrepreneurship and building biotechs?
That's a good question. I mean, I think part of the learning happens through classes and stuff, and there's always like a little bit of the HR training and development at companies. But so much of it comes from mentorship. I think the CSO at Syros at the when I was there, Eric Olson, was really inspirational. Taught a lot about how to manage an organization. That people are important. That one of the key things is reducing unforced errors. Right, science is hard, so we've got to just reduce our incidence of mistakes that we could have prevented. The other part is learning. So, in reading, and actually my wife and I both, we're both in biotech. And so we purchased book series from like Harvard Business Review and took classes at HBS and stuff. And I think that was really helpful. But, I feel very fortunate that there were some very good mentors and examples and leaders in some of the early organizations I was at to learn from.
So if I double click on this, now that you're acting CSO, is there one leadership behavior or one of the leaders who inspired you most that you would replicate what they have done as you are leading teams? And I loved how you framed it on the science part, right? Like science is hard. Yes. We need to reduce incidence of mistakes. And as you lead those teams with the ups and downs, this is where I'm asking these questions.
Yeah. So I think one of the one of the interesting features of science leadership in particular is that you're trained to be a technical expert in your career, right? You go through grad school, you get a PhD, maybe do a postdoc, and even work up in early levels of science and industry. You are a technical expert and ever deeper into your technical niche. And then suddenly, at some point, you start getting reports and you start to be more of a manager and a strategist and budgets and timelines and stuff. And you haven't really had much training to prepare you for that. So I think, part of this is, really embracing that, trying to learn from people around you, and especially some of the more senior people. Especially if you get some of the consultants that are actually like industry veterans that are semi-retired. The other one I think a lot of scientists, and I've struggled with this, and so other colleagues or managers, is that your skills will become obsolete someday. And so, your technical skills, like the way that I learned to do a Western blot, is no longer how any of the labs do a Western blot, right? That's okay. It's much faster now. That's wonderful. But like, I have to be okay listening to the people who are now the technical experts, and, understanding that my most important contributions aren't micromanaging them. It's listening to them and realize, the strategy and the value that we can create as a company and how it can help patients, and helping to match that with what the scientists are telling me to make that fit into, what we can actually accomplish with our budget and runway and timeline.
I love this. And you're framing it through practically unlearning sometime what
Yeah.
we've learned before, and also be humble enough, right, on those aspects where you're not an expert in managing teams. And I also have in my team scientists and physicians, so I relate to what you're saying, and it's an important piece of being humble and say, okay, I'm gonna learn how to lead people and manage people. So I love how you frame both. If we now go to your panel discussion, I'd love first to hear your view, your personal view about innovation and decentralization in clinical trials from a broad perspective.
Yeah. So there were kind of two main things I was really trying to push, in bringing to the panel, and that I want to make sure we covered for the discussion. And one of them was getting the right drugs for the right patient. There's been a lot of talk about precision medicine, biomarkers. This has been driven by the ever, cheaper ability to do NGS, for instance, next generation sequencing, which used to be quite expensive and prohibitive, and now is actually quite commonplace for a lot of patients, at least at research hospitals. So actually leveraging a lot of these biomarkers to match the right patients with the right drugs, and then also getting more innovative trial designs so that they resemble more of scientific hypothesis testing in an efficient way, um, you know, as opposed to, moving away from kind of the history of just, let's get to MTD, let's do an all comers advanced trial with the end stage patients that have seen a ton of prior therapies. I just don't think that has a very high probability of success. And even more, I think it actually weeds out drugs that would have value if they weren't put through that process. So that's kind of it at a high level.
Great. So now let's dig a little bit deeper. If we take, because it's a broad topic, and this is why I wanted to start at a high level, right? Like innovation and decentralization. So let's now take the decentralization piece in clinical trials. A lot has been said, a lot is going on. COVID kind of reshaped or accelerated, I should say, some of those pieces. How do you think of it today? And really, behind this question, I'd love for you if you can share what are we trying to solve with DCT?
Yeah. So on the decentralized side, I'm actually a big fan of the investigator-sponsored trials where, and this gets back to kind of hypothesis testing. So, if you could open up your clinical trial, and there were some umbrella trials a few years ago, but they're actually a bit less common now. And I was hoping that trend would catch on more. But, what I'd like to see is if you could open your trial, and maybe the company or the original sponsor has an initial hypothesis they're testing, well, you just can't possibly know everything. And so we've got to be able to, capture the value of all these other scientists and physician scientists around the country and around the world that are coming up with innovative applications and ideas. And so if they come to you with an IST, it would be nice if we could kind of bolt that onto the umbrella figure out kind of the fastest way we can test this hypothesis, figure out if there's a there. And if you do get some traction, then, expand out your path to try and cover that and get, approval. And this could work for, maybe you find a new accelerated path to your first approval that you hadn't even thought of, or maybe this is an opportunity to expand. And I think this is actually especially impactful in some of the smaller disease areas because maybe your original science couldn't really model it. There's not as good modeling available. It's not something there was originally on your radar. But if a really motivated physician scientist or patient community comes to you with this hypothesis, we've got to find a way to kind of decentralize, loosen up the structure to allow this sort of hypothesis testing.
And as you're thinking about those hypotheses from an investigator lens and from a company lens, so you're trying actually this umbrella idea and then taking innovation from outside, say new indications or other pieces, put it in this one, in like the umbrella trial you're thinking of. How do you think about, and did you discuss in the panel, the patient's implication of decentralized trial on their participation in those trials and how it's done globally?
Yeah, that was discussed a bit, and particularly around matching people up. And so I think there is kind of some need for innovation there. That if you go to one of the main research hubs to a major research hospital, getting on a clinical trial is going to be a lot easier. But if you're not in one of those areas, it can be a lot harder to find. Now, I think one of the models that is really encouraging to me is with some of these patient groups. So there's some foundations and patient disease centric organizations that have kind of taken this from a grassroots approach, and they will help connect patients with the trials, with the cutting edge research, give them a community of other people to talk to, and that can be phenomenal. I've seen cases where there was concern, oh, that's a rare disease, we'll have really hard time enrolling it. And because there was a foundation and a patient group behind it, that actually became the fastest enrolling cohort on the trial, which nobody really expected. But that just shows the power of what we can do in the digital age and the power of the patient experience.
Sure, and we've seen there's tremendous work of patient advocacy group, as you said, to help patients through their diseases, and clinical trial can several times be actually the best treatment option for patients. So the working with advocacy group is certainly impactful, and we should all be grateful for what they do. You touch on something that was kind of my follow-up question. On some area, you said some areas might not have those trials, and especially in your idea of, for example, IITs or IIS, it depends which academic group most probably will have the trial, etc. So I'm thinking from a diversity and equity approach of those initiatives. Has this been discussed, and how decentralized clinical trials or innovation in clinical trials can help improve diversity in clinical trials?
That's a really interesting point. I mean, I think just being able to capture more diverse geography helps that a lot. Some of the research hospitals and hubs happen to be in cities that may not capture the full diversity, and so just being able to make sure you're capturing potential patients from maybe rural areas, more in the South and Midwest. You know, I live in Boston, and so we've got MGH and Dana Farber and Brigham, and just the South, Memorial Sloan Kettering, multiple research hospitals in New York. But you've got to have mechanisms to be able to boost awareness and access. And then the other thing I think has really helped there is foundations have helped with patients getting to those sites. So maybe the only way to get that new treatment is to get to one of those research hubs. And if that's the case, there's got to be a way to help cover the cost. Because I think that is one of the prohibitive things is just, can you afford to, leave your hometown, get on a plane, fly, and put yourself up in that area for, an extended period of time if you're going through, multiple infusions of a therapy. So yeah, there's got to be some mechanism to cover that. And I don't think that's generally going to be coming from like insurance reimbursements as it's currently structured.
Those are great points from a participant plans, right? Especially for underserved communities, how we work with advocacy group or other mechanism to ensure the time, the transportation, as you said. So these are great examples you're giving. And then also community sites, I think, is one of the important pieces for diverse enrollment. As you discussed those, I would love to hear your point of view. What excites you most from an innovation standpoint in clinical trials that you think will literally change the way we are from designing to executing our clinical trials in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of touched on it earlier with the biomarkers, but it still feels like a very nascent application. The promise of NGS of sequencing of knowing exactly what the mutations are, what the condition is of the patient, that's still being rolled out. And so I think some of the front runners here are in like hem-onc, so in blood cancers, they're actually stratifying the disease based on your mutational profiling and linking that to what treatments you should get. Um, so that's starting to happen for standard of care treatments, but even on new clinical trials, there's still so many trials out there that just go into the phase one advanced all comers, solid tumor, for instance, in oncology, or try to go for a very broad swath. And I understand that capturing a broad swath has a potential implications for a larger market share down the road. And also people say, well, it's just a phase one. That's just supposed to be for tolerability and to set the dose. But a lot of investors and a lot of people are watching those trials now and do expect to show some sign of activity. Reason to believe that might be a bit unrealistic or optimistic in some cases, but nevertheless, that's kind of what's happening. So I just worry that by using these kind of older approaches, that we're actually missing stuff that could be quite impactful if you were using them in the right patients. And so yeah, am a strong advocate of leveraging all that science, preclinically that we're doing, and using biomarker approaches at the earliest stages of clinical work, at least as a correlate, so you can understand, well, did the people that were positive have a little bit higher activity than the ones that weren't? This is actually what Syros, the first company I was at, did. We showed that there was enrichment of response in the biomarker positive patients, and then when we go to the phase two and now phase three trial, we're only looking at selected patients. And you have a really, really high response rate because you pre-enrich patients. And what that does is then that actually gets you a smaller trial because you don't need as many patients because you essentially aren't enrolling as many likely negative patients in terms of response. And so, if you need less patients, you can enroll faster and complete your trials faster, which is a huge component of the cost. So, a lot of the cost, a huge portion of the cost in new drug development happens during the clinical trials. And so, anything you can do to shorten that and reduce the number of patients and not treat patients who are not likely to benefit is a good thing. And furthermore, I look at even older drugs. You look at something like Herceptin, which is used in HER2 breast cancer. That was going for the highest level of expression initially, and that got through and got an approval. And then subsequently, and partly because of real world evidence and what was happening in the clinics, they've since opened that up, and so they've figured out that there is benefit for an expanded swath of biomarker patients. And I think that's a really good way to go. Get a fast practical trial done, relatively more efficient in a selected population, and then open up exploration later, and potentially, do more of these ISTs, get the community engaged, and find out, well, where else can I use it?
Can I ask a follow-up question on biomarkers and your thought about uh, what's the hurdle to overcome to get where you're saying we should go? And then your thoughts about, we're hearing a lot about digital biomarkers. I'd love to hear also your thoughts about this.
So there's a couple hurdles, right? So technically, um, are patients able to get these assays done? Are they able to get sequencing done? That hurdle is rapidly falling away. Another one is, if the samples exist, can you access them? So if a company or another physician would like to run an assay on maybe some of the bank samples, maybe FFP blocks or frozen PBMCs or something from those patients, can you actually access those samples from the patient, or will you have to go get that patient to get a new assay done? Because if you can access the archive stuff and that's still relevant, then that's going to be another acceleration. The other is kind of on the corporate side with understanding, market. There is pushback on, well, I don't want to restrict what my potential, um, you label will be down the road. Uh, I still think I still think there's kind of a double-edged sword there that, maybe you're going for the widest possible label, but if that significantly reduces your probability of success, then I don't think that's actually an advantage there. Um, and then maybe the last is, if you have to run a diagnostic, prescribe a drug down the road, that could create an extra hurdle. You're going to have to get reimbursement. You're going to have to make the diagnostic more available. But, I actually think that also will go away because you look at how many patients, particularly in cancer, are getting sequencing or just the general population getting 23andMe and stuff like that done, is I think a lot of patients are already going to have sequencing done. And so you'll have a pretty good idea whether they're going to be positive for your assay when you run it, if you even need to, because if they've already had good quality sequencing done, maybe you don't even need to. And I'm focusing on gene sequencing here, but this would be true for some of the more complex, flow cytometry and pathology, which are all having advances lately. So yeah, so accessing the samples, accessing the data, and then convincing people that this is a good way to go, even though it faces some restrictions. This is also, doubly so for some of these rare diseases because it's how are we going to find these patients? How are we going to find enough of them? Even if we have a good idea that they would be biomarker positive, but that gets back to the trial design issue and the access to trials. And so I think all this stuff's getting solved. And I think it will get better, especially with all the digital technologies and even social media that's helping connect people.
Any thought about digital biomarkers?
You know, I think I think it's got promise, but I do worry about how good, medical records. You've got to get your medical records have to get up to par. So, AI and all these, computational techniques suffer from quality of data. And, I, like a lot of Americans, have gone through multiple insurers as they change jobs, have gone to multiple clinicians. And so having all of your own data in a coherent and systematized set that's actually interpretable is a big hurdle. I was actually working on a project a while back where we were able to import a ton of medical records, anonymized ones, to do some data analysis on. And the computational biologist came up to me. He's like, "Hey, I'm looking at this field, and there's 14 different string entries here." And I look at them, and it's like, "Hi hi HIGH, hi, plus sign up." It all meant the same thing, but that's actually a huge problem. And we had to create, a database of synonyms just to work on like one field of patient sample data. So I think that, as we get better at this, as we get to more digital and systematized medical records, that'll be a big help.
So, Michael, I want to now give you a word, and I would love your first reaction to it.
Okay.
So, the first one is leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's important, and it touches on what we started with here, which is that leadership really needs to be learned. They talk about natural born leaders, but I think there's a lot of learning to be had both through mentorship and classes and books and reading, and that to be a good leader means that you have to really take that seriously and take a commitment on yourself to constantly be learning and becoming better as a leader.
Drug development.
Man, it's expensive. But I think that these techniques that we were talking about, decentralization, biomarkers, I think there's ways to accelerate this and and make it a lot more efficient, which will make it more cost effective, cheaper, and raise the probability of success. Overall, the probability that any single pipeline or discovery program actually gets to an approved drug is pretty low. It could be that low as 5% in some fields, but I think we'll be getting a lot better at that because of all the things we were just talking about today.
What about innovation?
It's an amazing time, and I think especially being in a hub place like Boston, where I'm surrounded by all the amazing research coming out of Harvard and MIT. I'm working out of Harvard Innovation Labs, there's share space, and getting to hear all the amazing ideas that people are coming up with, either from bootstrap effort out of academia or working with venture funds. This is truly an amazing time for innovation and kind of, I think, an unprecedented leap for life sciences, and especially as we're being in 2024, coming out of kind of the investment lull. Things are really roaring back.
The last one is spread love in organizations.
Yeah, you got to lead with heart, and you've got to care, and you care about your people, care about your mission. I've mostly worked in oncology and small molecule oncology space, and reminding people that you're not just running an experiment today. You're potentially taking a step forwards towards giving somebody another Christmas with their family, or giving them more time with their loved ones. And we work I work in the life sciences. This has impacts on human health, and but at the same time, don't just grind your people and use that to make them work harder. Love the people in your organization and love your mission.
I love how you framed it, from caring for your people to caring for the patients we serve, because this is exactly why we wake up every morning in this industry. Any final word of wisdom for healthcare leaders around the world?
Listen, be humble, and never stop learning. Just because you're at the top, you still have opportunities for growth and learning, and that is a constant, lifelong process.
Well, what a great way to end this conversation. Michael, it was such a pleasure to have you with me today.
Thanks so much for having me on. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you all for listening to Spread Love in Organizations podcast. More episodes summarizing the MIT Sloan Healthcare and Bioinnovations Conference are available on SpreadLoveIO.com and wherever you get your podcast. And spread the word around you to inspire others and amplify this movement our world so desperately needs.